Today, I'm going to examine the two stories that are told to us in Genesis, the creation stories. And where else to talk about the creation stories but in the beginning? The book I use for this information is The Ethos of the Cosmos, written by William P. Brown. We have probably all noticed that there are two versions of the creation story. Many scholars have attributed this to that different original documents were used by different authors, and or a scribe may have put this contrasting story in just because they thought it was interesting. But Mr. Brown believes that these are the same stories. Too many P's going on there. These are the same stories, and that the labels that he uses for the authors is a priestly version and a Yahwist version. The priestly version starts with Genesis 1 and goes through chapter 2, verse 3. And it describes the theological side of creation. It tells how God laid the foundation of his universe and how man eventually fits into that universe. The Yahwist version starts in Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, and continues through many stories leading man back to God. Now, I'm not sure where this author uses where he got the term Yahwist, but the way I take it is that he looks at them as the authors that acted as narrators for the stories that are told in the rest of the Bible. And these stories explain how culture of mankind developed over time and fit within the cosmos. You will notice that many of the stories in the Bible are laid out with the characters and situation given first, and that sets the stage, and then later the plot of the story is given. For example, the priestly story has two parts. The first 3 days of of the story, God sets up the infrastructure of the cosmos. It started where it started, the cosmos was void and vacant of anything. It had no form. On day 1, God created light. On day 2, God separated heaven from the planets. On day 3, God separated the water from the dry ground and planted seeds for the plants and trees to grow. So at the moment, you'll notice that these objects have been created, but they are in a state of stagnation. They exist, but they do not have any function or purpose related to them. The next 3 days, days 4 through 6, God will define these functions and the purpose of these objects and animate them to be anatonomous. I love that word. I'm glad I wrote that in there. Day 4, light. Light is for the earth. It is provided by the sun, the moon, and the stars. Their movements rule the day, the night, and the seasons. Day 5, God fills the waters with sea creatures, and he fills the sky with birds, and he commands them to be fruitful and to multiply, each to their own kind. Day 6, God filled the dry land with 3 things. 1, the seeds that he planted on day 3 are to grow and provide sustenance for man and animals. 2, animals and the things that crawl. 3, He created man and woman who were created in God's image. They were to be fruitful and multiply as well, but also they were to have dominion over all of God's creatures in all of the creation, in water, sky, and land. Now that God has completed designing and implementing the cosmos, he will look at what he has done in those 6 days of creation and deem them as good. Day 7, God rested. God provides a practical application for men to follow in their own lives. God worked for 6 days and then he rested. All of creation is a blessing from God. We are to do what needs to be done during the week, but one day needs to be set aside for us to focus on our blessings that God has given us and to worship God. Note here that creation for the 6 days were deemed good, but rest on the 7th day was deemed holy. As I mentioned earlier, these repeating stories of creation perhaps were added because of a scribe finding a different source document and he added them. But more likely, this follows the design of Jewish literature. For example, Psalms will write a line and then follow that line with similar wording, but the meaning is either contrasting or parallel. Sometimes in Jewish literature, the author will raise the point to a climax and then decrease it down back to finish his point. And I believe this is what he's using in these stories. Notice that the story of creation has been repeated, but it is in the opposite order that the first story was made. The priestly story starts with void, and God creates the cosmos from a void up to where he creates mankind. Genesis 2:4 starts the Yahweh story with the man and follows their decline and separation from God. God planted his garden and he provided rain, but something was missing. God created man to till the ground of the garden and take care of the garden. That is Adam's vocation, to fill the gap in the garden that needed the tilling. A point we will be referring back to for most of these stories is that the earth or ground is a key feature in all of these stories. The name Adam is a Jewish play on words. In Hebrew, Adama means earth or ground. Hence, Adam, the play on words, is Adam's name, man is made from dust of the earth. The plants and animals have been created already, but as of yet, they have no names, and man had no real goal in life except to farm the garden. God gives Adam's domain over all the earth's creation and has him name the animals and the plants. At this point, plants and animals are commanded to be fruitful and multiply. But Adam is alone on earth. And God sees Adam's loneliness, and he creates woman from Adam's rib. He creates her as a companion and a helper. Her name is Eve, which means the mother of all living. They were equal companions in the garden, even though they had different origins. Life is good in the garden. God joins them in the evenings and communes with them. You ever had a mental image of that? God wandering down the paths and meets up with Adam and Eve, and they're just wandering down the path and talking, I don't know, theology, life, math, who knows. However, the story now introduces a talking serpent. Eve and the serpent are discussing the reasons that God forbid them to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge. The serpent is very crafty. He plants this seed in Eve's mind. Will you really die if you eat this? He then switches gears and continues the conversation by remarking how pretty the fruit is and how pretty the tree is and grows. Eve starts to reason that if the fruit and tree are so pretty, it must taste very good too. But then the kicker, the serpent questions God's intentions, that if they eat the fruit of knowledge, they will be equal to God. This is an exaggeration, of course, but it does start Eve thinking that if the tree and the fruit are special, and the wisdom gained from it will improve their status in the garden. She takes a bite. And when Adam takes a bite, the disobedience is complete. They do gain some knowledge, but that knowledge is not equal to God's. Their only understanding now is of fear and shame. When God joins them that evening in the garden, that evening they are not to be found. Where are you, he asked. But I think this is a rhetorical question because God sensed that the relationship between God and man has been broken. The two people have hidden themselves at the sound of God's voice because they were ashamed of their nakedness. They covered themselves with vegetation to hide their bodies. They were afraid of God seeing them naked. However, is all the knowledge? No, this, however, is all the knowledge that they gained, not the equality of God's wisdom, but only the realization of fear and shame, which was the beginning of sin. I'm pretty sure God was disappointed in them. He gave them one test, one thing to follow, and their response was failure. They failed miserably. Mankind is now cursed with death. Not immediate death, but their lives are now limited. But there were immediate penalties that were involved. The serpent must now slither on the ground and eat dust. The woman will have pain in childbirth, and also she will be subservient to man. The worst part of their penalty is that both of them will be removed from the garden. I imagine that tending the garden was a pretty easy job. Now, however, being outside of the garden, the ground was cursed with thistles, drought, and floods. Man still needs to be a tiller of the earth because he needed sustenance of the vegetables and fruit to eat. But the job will be much more difficult because the ground outside of the garden has been cursed. But God does not completely abandon them. He makes clothes for them from an animal hide. And I suspect that God cared for them in many other ways as well. The garden is the epicenter of God's earthly cosmos. But now Adam and Eve are one level removed from that. The garden is the center, and now they are removed from it. They're outside of utopia. Not to mention that they also do not have a one-on-one relationship with God. The fallen people now need to cope with life in an cursed environment. But life goes on. The couple had 2 children, Cain and Abel. The story now introduces violence to man's list of sin. Cain is a tiller of the earth, just like his father Adam. But his brother Abel was a shepherd. The 2 brothers each made a sacrifice to God. Cain offers the first fruits of his field, while Abel offers the firstborn lamb of his flock. God rejects Cain's offering. It's not really stated why it's rejected, but perhaps it was because it was offered without the proper attitude. Meanwhile, God accepts Abel's offering because it was offered with a good attitude. God explains to Cain that if he can do better and that he will be accepted if he controls the demon that is working within him. Cain becomes very angry because of all of this, and he plots to kill Abel. After the deed is carried out, he asks Cain where his brother is. Cain's response is arrogant. I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Note here that as we get further from the garden and deeper into sin, responsibility is less prevalent. While still in the garden, Adam and Eve confessed their sin right away of eating the fruit, but they blamed each other right down from person to person. Adam blamed his wife, Eve blamed the serpent. Here, Cain denies any responsibility to this crime. As mentioned earlier, the ground plays a big part in most of these stories. Cain may deny his guilt to God, but the ground holds Abel's blood and it cries out to God about the crime. Now we come to the next level of removal from the garden. Adam was cursed to work much harder to till the soil for a living, but Cain is removed even further from the garden, and the ground is cursed to even more to him, so that now he cannot even make a living for sustenance from the ground, and he must become a wanderer. According to the Yahweh story told so far, there weren't many people living on earth. Cain's story now tells us how civilization or culture has started. Cain takes a wife eventually in his wanders, and he has a son, and he names his son Enoch. And it seemed a little peculiar to me, but his son built this city, and he named it Enoch, apparently after himself. We are given a genealogy of several generations up to Methuselah, who has a son named Lamech, who kills a young man for wounding him. He has taken murder to a new height. When he gets home, he almost braggingly calls his wife and his children together so that he can defend his action of killing this young man. And he takes the lesson he learned. Cain was afraid when he was wandering that he would be attacked or anything, and God gave him protection from any harm. Lamech takes this even further. He said that Cain was given 7 times protection, but he is going to be protected 77 times over. Society is now devolved in such a way to such a point that Lamech is using ancestral history to defend his ever-increasing capability to sin. But not all is lost. Lamech has a son named Noah. At Noah's birth, Lamech says, out of the ground that God cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the toil of our hands. The story of Noah tells us that mankind has sunk so deep into sin that only Noah and his family are worthy to be saved from destruction. God plans to flood the earth to remove the contamination caused by sin. Not only will he destroy all of mankind, but he will cleanse the ground of the original curse caused by Adam. This goes back to Lamech's prophecy that Noah will relieve man's toil from the ground. The parallels of this story of creation and this story of the creation cannot be denied. Before anything happened in creation, the water covered earth and the cosmos started from there. Now the flood covers the earth to remove the sinful nature of man. So there will be a new beginning, a second chance for mankind. Just as God separated the water from the dry land so life could have a place to live, Noah, his family, and the animals survived the flood on the ark until the water was removed and dry land appeared again. Noah is now considered the new Adam. His bloodline, through his son Shem, will create a genealogy of the human race through to Jesus. In verse 9:20 of Genesis, the story calls Noah a man of the soil, and he plants a new vineyard. Again, man's vocation is tilling the ground. While this vineyard is not the Garden of Eden, it does play a role in the advancement of mankind. I won't go into that story right now, but it's where branch took off. And this is a good place to stop today's message, because our narrator, the Yahwist, has taken us in a complete circle. Man had life good in the garden, but eventually had a feeling that something was missing, something they needed that God had not provided for them. Eve was persuaded by the serpent that they should have knowledge equal to God. Cain felt that he deserved acceptance for his sacrifice equal to his brother. Lamech felt that he deserved more allowance for his sin than his forefather Cain received. Only Noah performed all of the tasks that God had asked him to complete. The farther mankind was removed from God and from the garden, the more and more evil they accepted as normal, until God had had enough and wiped the slate clean. But note, God will always leave a way out for mankind to survive, and that becomes Noah's vocation. In closing, I want you to kind of reflect on the stories that we covered today and how they were structured. As you read the rest of the stories in the Bible, see how culture and society develops and what the lessons are that we're learning from these characters. How does the character or circumstance of each story teach us how mankind developed in a way that brings us closer to God? As we go into the New Testament, does our understanding of God develop to a point where we live better lives for God? When we feel that something is missing in our lives, do we turn to God or to ourselves to fill that void like many of our ancestors did?